session with Grant. To host him, he's a strategist, an executive coach and senior lecturer. And this evening is in collaboration with the Elliot Osborne Leadership Institute. Grant is on our faculty and I'm the director. Grant, we're excited to learn from you, your expertise as it's applied to the business world, the business schools, and the business of community-based organizations. In Grant's recent book, Passion, Power, and Purpose, he's designed this as a guide and a manual to make strategy accessible. What is unique to Grant's enabling premise is the personal value of the strategy model to set your own direction, as well as the value it offers across organizations and businesses alike, to be equipped to have strategy conversations that will shape future direction. In his own words, strategy is about mastering uncertainty rather than sticking to a formula. And this guide comes at a perfect time as we start to recover from the pandemic. So given the diversity of the audience this evening, you who've shown up, we encourage you to apply Grant's model to your specific context and seek out the tools that fit best for you. In asking Grant to take over and thanking you in advance for your presentation this evening, I want to make sure that you mute yourselves and put your questions and comments in the chat during Grant's presentation. Grant, welcome, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Viv. That's a perfect introduction. You've summarized the book and its intent so well. And thank you, Lisa and Brenna from ORT, for all the work you've put in to making this webinar happen. Really appreciate it a lot. And so we're going to talk about my book. Did you show the book, by the way? But if you didn't, let me hold it up. Let me make sure that you can see the real thing. So it's titled Passion, Power, and Purpose. Ah, there you go. You've got one too. And the subtitle is Engaging with Strategy in Your Organization and Your Life. This was quite important for me to, as Viv says, draw the link between the theoretical strategy we use in business and in organizations to the applied strategy that leaders need to think about when they build consciousness and competence. And I realized over 20 years of working in the field of strategy that these tools that are so analytical and head-based are equally applicable in our personal lives to empower us. My view of strategy is that strategy empowers us. And really it reflects the middle word of the title, passion, power, and purpose. It links our passion and it allows us to move in the direction of our purpose. And I'd like to speak about some of these concepts with you this evening. I realize that we're probably having a conversation which is more about how a book like this, how the tools in the book can make a difference in your life or in the lives of those that are in your circle. And well, many of us are business owners. We're not necessarily running big organizations, but we've got to be effective in running our own lives and running our own businesses. And I hope you'll see that when we look at some of these tools, we can apply them to ourselves to be more empowered and more purposeful and harness our energy. You know, we all want to do good in the world to make something of our lives, and that's where the passion comes from. But often I believe passion, unbridled, unharnessed, without purpose, without focus, doesn't go very far. And passion and purpose without the tools, the power to enable us to move forward is a frustrating journey. So this is what the book is really all about. I thought that, and please don't hesitate to, in the chat, interrupt and ask a question as we go. But I'm going to talk a little bit and maybe just give you a context for why I wrote this book, what my background is. Perhaps that's useful to give you a sense of the journey that has led to this book. I must say I've held a dual focus in my personal life. I've been interested in psychology, the world of people, and in computer science, which is a much more analytical space. I did an honors in computer science. I did a master's in psychology. and I got into the world of work, of big corporates. But what I discovered was my abiding interest was more in the link between the focus, the field of behavior, of psychology, and that of the mind. So how do we bring together behavior, if you like, the heart of engagement, and the focus on analytical work, which is really about the head? How do we bring the head and the heart together? Well, I did a PhD then some 20 years ago, where my focus really was on how to lead strategically, understanding ourselves, understanding behavior. My concern, I must be honest, is working in the space of business schools. I teach on many MBA programs. In Cape Town, I teach on the UCT MBA. I teach strategy. That MBA programs have traditionally been a work of the mind. They've been focused on the analytics. There's been very little focus on behavior, on a work of the heart, and understanding how to influence or shape behavior. This, I believe, has been a great failing, because our need as we engage in the world to be effective, to be purposeful, is to understand behavior and the tools to be able to logically apply what is needed to be able to move forward with purpose. So if you think of an analogy of head, heart, and hands, I like to think that that's what this book is about. At the end of each chapter, there are a set of self-reflective questions. So while my book is, in fact, a reference text on the UCT MBA in strategy, it's also a personal book for professionals, for any of us, to be able to look at the theory, look at how it's applied, look at a framework to engage with this, and then apply it to our own lives. At the end of each chapter, there are a set of self-reflective questions. You know, my feeling is that when we focus on these topics of engaging with strategy, head, heart, and hands, we become more resilient. And I think that at the end of well, I don't know if it's the end of, but as we get to this point in this pandemic-sized shock we are facing, all of us in different ways, the need to apply these tools to build resilience, to lead ourselves more effectively, is more important than ever before. Viv, just as you've said. You know, and so in the book, I start the book because I wrote the book before the pandemic. It got published during the pandemic. And so I updated the book to make sure that it was relevant in the face of this kind of volatility, this kind of change. You know, when we engage in our lives strategically in a world that is so volatile, it's a different kind of strategy to the world that our grandparents may have known, which was perhaps, maybe not, less volatile, more stable. You know, when you're in a world that doesn't change much, the approach to strategy is to look to the past to learn about the future. But in a volatile, we talk about VUCA times. I'm sure you've heard the acronym VUCA: volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And when we are faced with all of this uncertainty, we've got to approach strategy differently. We've got to apply some of the tools that are in the book to be able to imagine the future and to be resilient in the face of VUCA times. And so one of the frameworks that really struck me and that I've incorporated in the book is the work of Diane Kutu, who talks about how we go about building personal resilience. And I want to just, before I open up to questions and engage with all of you, I want to just share what Diane Kutu says about being strategically relevant and resilient. She says, resilient people have to work across three elements. And she, in fact, draws a triangle and she lists each element on the triangle. The top of the triangle, the first thing resilient people do is they face reality. Look at us facing reality on Zoom. We wouldn't have dreamt about it before. We face reality. This is the new world. At the bottom left corner of the triangle, Diane Kutu puts the second element of resilience, and that is improvise. In other words, don't be paralyzed by the volatility, the new reality. Be ready to be adaptive, improvise. And the bottom right corner of the triangle is the most important corner of all. And in fact, it is the third word in my title, Passion, Power, and Purpose, purpose. She says, anchor in meaning. This is so important. And I think of us, I presume we're mostly a Jewish audience, about how important it is to anchor in meaning, to be able to provide internal clarity of what's important and what we're about and how we make a difference and who we are. Because purpose is about identity, right? You think about these three elements: face reality, improvise, but anchor in meaning. And it's true for us personally, and it's true for the people who follow us in our organizations. You know, you can have any two of those and be okay in the world. But to be truly resilient, you need all three. And so Viv has been insisting that I don't just talk so theoretically. I try and find some practical examples of this. Viv, so I was thinking about an appropriate example. You know, I thought appropriate example of this idea of Diane Kutu: face reality, improvise, anchor in meaning, to be resilient in a volatile world, was the story of Viktor Frankl. Well, let's think about Viktor Frankl and how impactful he was in our world and still is, and what he went through. And I'm sure you would agree with me that while many people succumbed to the horror of the Holocaust, while many people couldn't improvise to survive, and well, maybe there was an anchoring in meaning, but it was, you know, in the onslaught of those times, Viktor Frankl found a way. And Viktor Frankl, when he was incarcerated, he had a young bride, as far as I understand, and he managed to face that ghastly reality, find a way to survive, and I suspect anchor in meaning, hope, identity, purpose. But when Viktor Frankl was finally released, and I presume that purpose and meaning and hope was about reuniting with his family, only to discover, of course, the horror of extermination. None of them were alive. They had been murdered. Viktor Frankl didn't succumb. He kept going because he faced that new reality, and he improvised yet again because he had identity, he had purpose. So I really like this idea of building resilience by applying some of these strategy tools and frameworks to engage with uncertainty. Sometimes it's not nice, sometimes it's unpleasant. I suspect that all of us on this call have experienced serious sadness and unpleasantness as a result of the pandemic we're in, but we're here. And perhaps the model of Diane Kutu helps us think about it, and the tools and frameworks in my book help us engage effectively to stay resilient and purposeful. I think I should pause, guys. I think I've been going at this for a while. I could keep going and start to talk about the book and how the book is, how I've framed the book, but I'd like to pause for a moment just to check in. I want to hear your voices and your questions, and of course your wisdom. It's a privilege to be here, so I'd love to hear from you. Any thoughts or questions before we continue? Feel free to unmute or raise your hand or just write something in the chat. That'd be great. I bet that some of you have some wisdom and insight to share right now, and I'd love to hear. And I see that, Ron, you've just put your camera on. That's a good sign. So I'm wondering if perhaps you had a question or a comment that you might want to add at this point.
Ron, with synchronicity, because I was somebody was Freedom Day, and we were talking about what does it mean freedom. And
I'm sorry, Ron, I'm not hearing you at all. You're breaking up.
Hear me now?
Perfectly. That's great.
God, technology, love it.
Oh, no.
Let me start again. I said there was an interesting synchronicity because I was in a meeting and we were talking about Freedom Day.
Yes.
And we talked about freedom. And the question was, what is meaning? What does freedom mean to you? And I talked about Viktor Frankl, and he talked about the ultimate freedom is the freedom to create our own meaning in any situation, which is really about mindset, really. But it was interesting. I didn't actually, it wasn't a group of Jewish people, and I didn't go into how important, you know, that sentiment is to create freedom in that kind of horrific situation. But I guess, you know, this country, so there's an interesting parallel, isn't there, between the history of this country and some of the Jewish situations. But I think Frankel is a universal truth. So that's it's not really a question, just a reflection.
It's a beautiful reflection, Ron, because of course, Viktor Frankl wrote about search for meaning. And I think about Nelson Mandela saying he didn't spend a day in prison because he wasn't in prison in his mind. And I think this is really about how do we frame ourselves to be able to be empowered, you know, and make a difference, create meaning. Thank you. I appreciate your comment. Any other questions or comments at this point about our topic tonight?
Grant, a question came through to me around personal qualities leaders need to think and lead strategy. I don't know if you're going to go into that further along or if you want to touch on it now.
No, I'd love to talk about it. It's a really good question. What are the personal qualities leaders need to lead strategically? And in my opinion, the first one is to know ourselves. The first quality is to know ourselves. And when we know ourselves, we know our preferences. It comes back to behavior. You see, this is why I think strategy is not only about analytics, it's also about understanding ourselves and understanding others. We need to understand ourselves because when we do, we recognize that we have preferences. In fact, in my PhD, my work was on leadership focus. When we have a preference, we tend to focus on some things, perhaps more than on other things. And we need to understand our preferences, know ourselves. And then we need to consider what our blind spots are and make sure that we have people around us or that we stretch and grow to be able to engage in the less preferred sides that we may not be thinking about, that others are better able to explore with us. And when we do that, I think we lead more effectively, we lead strategically. I'd be happy to speak more about that subject because I think it's a really interesting one. You know, it speaks to not just about what we know about ourselves, but when we are in a business setting, or an organization setting, how we engage with the key groups of people that need to be engaged with in order to be effective in our world of work. You know, ultimately, to be effective in your organization, you need to have a strategic alignment. We need to have an appreciation of what's needed most at each point in time. And so understanding ourselves and understanding others in our team and knowing what to value people for and knowing how to translate what they are valued for into the strategy they have to execute, if you've got a team executing that strategy, and knowing what customers want most, and not just customers, but, you know, different stakeholders, constituents, or whoever it is that you are there to serve. Finding alignment is crucial. And so again, it comes back to understanding what people want and need most and be able to respond appropriately. When we optimize alignment in an organizational system, we have much more effective businesses. I hope that makes sense. Any other thoughts or questions before we continue? Because what I would like to do next is explain how the book is structured and how the book is designed to be practical. I do teach in business schools quite a lot. I also work as a management consultant. But I think of myself more as a practical kind of person than a theoretical kind of person. In fact, you know, they're academics at university, but I think of myself as a pracademic. So I like to take the theory and make it applied. I like to take the complexity and look at how we simplify it. You know, and if I had to continue that, answering that question, Lisa, that you asked, which is such a good question. A good leader working strategically approaches the world within which they're leading with multiple perspectives. Not a single view, but multiple views. Now, multiple views starts to sound complex, but if you had to apply simplicity to multiple perspectives, then, ladies and gentlemen, there are 4 perspectives, right? And the 4 perspectives are the following. Top down. What do I or we, the leadership, believe we need to do? What direction should we go in? Top down to set direction. But top down setting direction doesn't work unless we also focus on those we serve and those who work with us. So we talk about bottom up for engagement. When you've got engagement, you're likely to have customer centricity. When you've got employees who are engaged, you're likely to have customers who are loyal. I hope that makes sense. You know, a top-down traditional approach, which is an authoritarian approach, I'll tell you what to do and you obey, often leaves employees disengaged. And when employees are disengaged, customers aren't well served. We don't want to have a culture of obligation. We want to have a culture of ownership, of passion, ownership, and purpose. So top down for direction, but bottom up for engagement. And guys, I bet you all know this. These are basic truths. But there are 2 more perspectives that we need when we lead strategically. And they're quite simple. We need to look outside of our sphere at the changing world, outside in. Why? Because we want to stay relevant. We want to face reality. The world keeps on changing, and there's, you know, you can think of change at the political level, economic, social, technology, environment, governance, etc. There's an acronym that you can use, PESTLE, to think about what's going on out there and how does it impact us. So we look outside in to stay relevant. We look outside in so we are able to adapt to the new rules that are set out there. You know, guys, it's important, even if we are innovators, as leaders, it's important for us to be good rule takers. I hope you get what I mean. To be a good rule taker means we adapt so that we stay relevant. Now, the last perspective, multiple perspectives, is inside out. We want to understand what we've got in our sphere, in our lives. And what have I got in my life? What are my competencies? What is my experience? In my small organization, what have I got aside from me? And so too for you. We look inside out because we want to find leverage, guys. We want to be able to put the pieces of the puzzle of what we've got and how we can use what we've got in such a way that we get leverage. And when we get leverage, we can become a rule maker. We can use our leverage to be unique. Are you with me, guys? Top down, we set direction. But we don't do it in an authoritarian way where we disengage people. Top down for direction to inspire purpose. Bottom up for engagement, because we want other people's perspectives and ideas. We want them to be engaged because when they're engaged, our customers are going to be well served. Outside in, to make sure we stay relevant and we're good rule takers, well, as we adapt. Remember what Diane Puter said, what Viktor Frankl did. We face reality and we improvise. But we don't face the new reality and improvise without purpose. You know, purpose is set top down. So outside in, just irrelevant. And inside out because we've got something unique. How do we use what we've got in our lives, in our businesses, to find leverage so we can come up with something new? We can become a rule maker too. So I quite like, you know, we could talk in my book, I talk about the different schools of thought that strategists have come up with different ways of approaching strategy. You know, there's a lot of brilliance out there, but we want to try and distill it to a pragmatic view, in my opinion, top down, bottom up, outside in, and inside out. And Lisa, you said, I think that you have got through quite a bit of the book. And congratulations for doing that, because what the book does is it provides a practical framework for engaging in a strategic conversation. Now, that conversation can be self-reflection, but it can be a conversation with your team. What's going on today that's having an impact on us? Outside in, remember, outside in for relevance, inside out, we'll look for the leverage, we'll look for the changes. But when we have this conversation, what's going on today, we've also got to ask this question. And I think this is really important, ladies and gentlemen. How well aligned is my business right now? How well aligned am I right now in my world? You know, I don't know about you, but I find it's hard to let go of the stuff that I always do. But the truth of it is that when people want things differently, I have to understand the value of letting go in order to create a vacuum for trying something that is more meaningful. So we look for, when we say what's going on today that's having an impact on our lives, we're looking for gaps. We need to understand what the threats are to the current way of doing things, what the opportunities are in the gaps. And there always will be gaps. And I need to look for gaps in my life to be able to recognize how I need to change, to be better aligned, to be better able to deliver to the new world. And all of us are doing that. Look at us on Zoom, right? I mean, before we used to be face-to-face, and I don't know about you, but I can tell you in my life, I am 10 times more effective on this PC than having to fly to Joburg or someplace in Africa, all that dead time. You know, I don't have to do that anymore. I can deliver and much more effectively from my home, you know, or from my office. So I'm just making the point that we start our conversation by saying, Lisa, you probably remember this in this framework, what's going on today? Out there in here, where are the gaps? And then, of course, the second part of an important conversation, if you're leading yourself strategically, is where am I going to? What's my purpose? Yeah, and that's what's my longer term purpose for my life, for my organization? And what are my shorter term priorities? What do I want to accomplish this year, this financial year, this calendar year? Because you can't do everything, right? But what should I do? What should I focus on now to take me a step towards my purpose, my vision? And the interesting thing, when you apply this engagement in strategy, this conversation, today, future, you start to identify options. When I look at where I'm heading to, there are gaps between where I am and where I want to get to. I want to write a few more books. And I'm sure you guys have got some interesting plans and aspirations for yourself. Well, but where am I now? And what are the gaps I'm creating between where I am now and where I'm trying to get to? And we want to look at these two areas of gaps. The one area of gaps is in the today conversation. What's going on today out there that's changing? What's going on today within my team, in my life that's changing? Where are the gaps? What about where I'm heading to, the future, long-term and short-term? What about those gaps? We want to find gaps. You know, as a pracademic, I say we need to be gapologists. You know, in your conversation with yourself or your team, don't be afraid of gaps. Look for gaps. Don't go to the dentist, turn them into options. You know, a gap is an opportunity or it's a threat. Well, look at all of those opportunities and threats and ask this third question in your strategic conversation. What are my options? What are our options to go forward? And then you've got to think about, well, which of those options are the most important ones and which should I turn into action? You know, a lot of strategy, when I engage with strategy, mustn't just be thinking, it must be doing. And how do we take action with those most important options? Ladies and gentlemen, the way we take action is we have a behavioral orientation. You know, action, I said to you, head, heart, and hands. Action is all about hand-holding, right? And focusing on the hearts. How do you change people's feeling about what's important? You know, there's a professor by the name of John Cotter. He wrote a book called Leading Change. And he said, you know, if you really want to make change happen, if you want to execute your strategy, he said, you've got to think about the hearts and minds of the people you're trying to influence. And I really like that because I'm not such a heart guy, I'm more a head guy. And I had to learn that it's important not just to analyze, but to empathize. Hearts and minds, right? To make change happen. And so in my book, I've got a framework for engaging in a strategic conversation, which is today, out there in here, the future, long-term, short-term, where are the gaps? Look for the gaps. And then options. What are my options? How do I prioritize them? And actions. Today, future, options, actions. And in fact, the rest of the book is all about the tools you can use in a today conversation out there, competitive strategy. in the today conversation within your team, which is all about organizational strategy. It's about behavior and personality and culture. An important part of the book is, how do I optimize strategic alignment so I close gaps? And I'll tell you what, when you can optimize alignment, you are more effective. An organization that is perfectly aligned is often perfectly effective, but you don't want to have a static situation. So we look at the tools for today conversation. We look at the tools for how do you set future direction, your purpose. What is purpose? Identity, vision, our values. How do we set shorter term goals, our stretch goals, those to move forward? How do we come up with options to close the gaps? And that's the creative part of our strategy. To be able to apply tools that allow us systematically to be creative and innovative. That's important in strategy. And lastly, how do we take action? And really, as I said, action is a lot about leading change and helping people change. So that's really what the book's about. And I hope that you are perhaps curious and would like to ask a question or make a comment or share some of your own wisdom. So we've had 2 brilliant inputs, and I'm wondering who else would like to share or pose a question for our conversation. Feel free to write in the chat or raise your hand or just unmute.
Grant, I'm looking around the Zoom room, and I'm seeing a really interesting mix of people in community organizations, people in business, people in professions, accountancy, psychologists, etc. What would you say are some of the sort of focus that is either the bridge between all of us, or kind of unique in terms of these different almost collectives, and the kind of way in which we need to engage differently around maybe strategy or purpose?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I believe that what we have in common is a need to build conscious competence, and all of us do in our different ways. All of us do in our personal worlds. This is why we're here on this webinar. We're focusing deeply on ourselves and how to be effective in the world and how to make a difference in the world we choose to with purpose. And so I think that what we have in common is a need to understand our behavior and that of others, and then to apply some of the tools that organization leaders use to go beyond that, to be able to make a difference. In other words, so we carry passion, we understand ourselves, but to understand how to translate how we're different, to cover off on blind spots, and to move forward to realize purpose, where purpose is about making a difference in our world, making a difference in the world of others. And I think, to me, let me give you an example. I tend to work in both private and public sector organizations. In both big and small organizations, I spend time working with individuals. I want to give you an example of an organization that inspires me. And the organization actually, well, there are many organizations that do, and many leaders of organizations that inspire me. And maybe I should focus on 2. The first one is not a South African organization. It's an African organization in East Africa and Kenya called Safaricom. And I bet that all of us have heard of Safaricom. They're a big telco. They're like MTN. But boy, oh boy, they're a lot more than MTN, because what Safaricom did was it invented and popularized the cashless payment service M-Pesa, where people who were disenfranchised from banks and financial services could actually get paid and pay using their cell phones. And Safaricom pioneered this. Safaricom today is bigger on the Kenyan Stock Exchange than all of the financial services companies combined. Now, that's not what impresses me about Safaricom. What impresses me about Safaricom is how the leadership trust each other, how they work together as a team, how their values guide them in a way that inspires everyone else, their staff, they're an employer of choice, their customers. Everyone, in fact, in East Africa society strives to be associated with Safaricom. What's going on at Safaricom? I had the privilege in 2019, just before the pandemic, to spend some time with the C-suite, the executive, the people on the executive team at Safaricom, talking with them. It was 2 weeks after Bob Collymore, their loved CEO, died of cancer in his 50s. They were there, they were focused. It was a very traumatic time for Safaricom. But when they talked about their CEO and they talked about the company, there was such synergy, such what I call shared value. And I want you just to hold this phrase, shared value, because it's so important. It's the bridge between private business and the public sector. It's the bridge between NGOs and I want you to think about, how do we operate with a principle of shared value? And Safaricom does. Well, Safaricom is what they call themselves, a purpose-led organization. And they explained to me at the time that there are 3 elements to their purpose. I was quite intrigued to hear what they were. They say they focus on being humane, on humaneness. That's important. What does humaneness mean? Now, this is a telco, for goodness sake, and they're using this concept of humaneness. Don't you have a sense of them respecting the dignity of everyone? That's what they strive for. The second element, women's empowerment. They focus on women's empowerment. You think about gender-based violence and Me Too and goodness knows what goes on in this country. Well, Safaricom says that their second anchor to their purpose is women's empowerment. And the third element of their purpose is a sustainable planet. A sustainable planet. Humaneness, women's empowerment, and a sustainable planet. And my goodness, none of that has to do with a telco, but it has a lot to do with attracting the best and the brightest. And they walk the talk. That's their purpose, and it's linked to their values, and it's shared identity. And that builds trust. They have a creche at work. They know when to act appropriately in congruence with those values, with that purpose. And it makes Safaricom very much admired. It makes Safaricom very successful. I'm just making the point, about what we share in common and what big business and small business in the private sector have to learn from the public sector and from NGO, because NGOs and the public sector understand shared value. So the second organization I'm thinking about is Discovery. Well, I suspect many of you are members of Discovery. In fact, I'm running a leadership program, 2 leadership programs with Discovery right now. And Discovery, they have astonishing values and a founder-led organization, and that makes a difference. But what Discovery is right from the start is a shared value organization. And what that means for Adrian Gore and for the senior executives is they don't do anything just for profit. They won't do it unless it's going to make a positive difference to the world in which they operate. That's their philosophy, shared value. Unless we create value for those we are there to serve, we won't do it. That's kind of a nice principle. So maybe that just starts to tie some of the bits together that helps us think, as a group from all sectors on the Zoom call. I do see a question coming up, guys, in the chat, from Felicity Israel. How do you get your members or employees to feel more involved in the organizational business as if they are needed? I love that question, Felicity, because you think about, perhaps I hope this is past tense. We used to focus on efficiency. We had a top-down approach to the organization. we tell you what to do and you do it. And if you want to get paid, you're obliged to do it. You know, obligation only gets you so much contribution. Now, the question in my mind is all about behavior, understanding ourselves and understanding others. We're different. And how do we get engagement? We get engagement by having conversations, bottom up, not just top down. And bottom up conversations are not just about let's hear your ideas, but let me understand you and how you come to work in a way that might be different to me. When we make people feel safe in the organization, we create a culture of psychological safety. People are likely to do more. Now, how do we create a culture of psychological safety? It does require a serious bottom-up inclusion, understanding people, seeing people, hearing people. And when we create psychological safety, we have an attitude which is far more than obligation. It's an attitude of belonging, of loyalty. And when people feel safe and they feel like they belong, they're likely to deliver more than when they just feel obliged. But Felicity, there's another step, and the third step must be to help people in the organization feel like they share in our purpose. That's creating a culture of ownership. Imagine an organization or a team where we are owners together. We share purpose, we share value. And when you create a culture of ownership, you get even more performance. I hope that makes sense, because there are processes to engage in order to move from obligation to belonging, but ultimately we strive for shared ownership, shared value. And I believe the way we do it is through uniting the three elements of my book: passion, power, and purpose. Apply the strategy tools in your framework. Have the strategy conversation today, future options, actions, together with your people. Take their options and their ideas. Engage in discussion and debate to explore which options we should give priority. Explore purpose like Safaricom did. It wasn't the C-suite that came up with the idea that their purpose is humaneness, women's empowerment, and a sustainable environment, the planet. That was done by a lot of conversation with the people who belong in their ecosystem. So any more comments?
Can I just pick up on that?
Yeah, please, Viv.
So if you engaging often in this instance, from the bottom up, and the team prioritizes, for example, women empowerment,
Yes.
and it may not be a core outcome for the business, what is the obligation then of the kind of top down that is trying to align the business with its objectives? I'm just using women empowerment as an example, but if you brought in an entire group of millennials and there was a sort of detour that was going in a particular direction that wasn't necessarily useful for the business, how would one then recalibrate the strategy?
Yeah, I think that's an important question about, we've got to look strategically at the business and its objectives, and we've got to look at the employees and the culture, and we've got to ask what's important for these employees to make them feel valued. But there has to be an alignment between the business objectives and what staff are made to feel valued for. But so there are two elements to this. Operational strategy, when we want them to do things to meet our objectives, we've got to make sure they feel valued for doing those things. But there's another element of building trust and focusing on employees and their circumstances and their lives. One of the things Adrian Gore is very worried about right now is how Discovery maintains its unique customer-orientated culture in a hybrid work environment where people at the junior level who work at Discovery aren't in comfortable homes, don't have good Wi-Fi, have, family and children and dogs and goodness knows what all over the place, and are still expected to deliver outstanding service. So his concern, Discovery's concern, is to focus in on the circumstances of that person and make them feel valued. What are their personal needs to feel safe and valued? And to focus on Discovery's objectives, which is to deliver outstanding service. When you focus on the employee and make them feel valued, employee centricity leads to customer centricity. So you need to work in multiple dimensions. Any other thoughts? Because I suspect from all of you on the call, you have experience. You would also have some wisdom to share on this topic of how we engage effectively in our world of work, how we lead strategically, both in our organizations and in our lives.
I have a question, Grant, but I'm hoping someone else is going to ask a question from the audience.
Sure.
Please, doesn't anyone in Entrepreneur Network have a question to ask Grant? You've got his full attention.
I've got a point of view on anything, so try me.
Bev Wynn, awesome.
I just find the whole, you talk a lot about cohesion and company ethos, and it's a challenge for entrepreneur or any business owner now to, how do you differentiate how do you create cohesion within your staff when, like, I'm sure Discovery, they're addressing this quite sort of like hands-on, but how do you create company culture in a time when there is no culture, like no one's sitting together in an office, no one's walking into a room and saying, what's your view on this? So we're losing that connectivity of being in offices together, and it has its upside. But I think long-term, in terms of creating a company cohesiveness and company culture, we're going to start suffering around that. It was quite wonderful in the beginning that we're all sitting at home and having these Zoom meetings, but now we're going to see a bit of hangover from that. So I was just wondering, how do you create company culture in a time when we are so disconnected from each other?
Yeah, that's what Adrian Gore is asking about Discovery. He's really worried about it. I think it's a really important question, Bev. And so I can only speak with some very limited experience, because this is new, right, for all of us, isn't it? There are, of course, virtual organizations that are operating mainly in the tech space, where I think it's a go-it-alone kind of mentality that, introverted, kind of geeky people who are quite comfortable to work separately and then come together in a virtual space to share whatever they're doing. But for most of us, it's not like that. And most of us need some connection. What I'd like to do is just share my own experience. And I suspect you would probably echo what I'm about to say. Well, Zoom or MS Teams or whatever you're using online can be a bit overwhelming at the end of the day. Used right, I think it can build incredible team cohesion. It can build a lot of reassurance and can, in fact, be a facility for meaningful conversations. How do I experience this? Well, I have a professional forum of 13 people. We meet every 2 weeks online for 2 hours. Our cameras are always on, right? Because the 13 of us we're connecting. I have to say, what a colleague said to me the other day when she teaches, she says, we understand the bandwidth issue, but when people are online engaging with one another and they have their cameras off, it's a bit like they've got a black bag over their head with their name on the bag. It's like I'm talking to a black bag. If you really want to focus and engage, got to put your cameras on. And so, in this forum that, we have our cameras on, the 13 of us, boy, oh boy, at the end of that 2-hour session, it feels for me like we've really connected. I think we are stronger today than we were a year ago. Now, the other space is when I work on programs, strategy or leadership programs with corporates or in the business school setting. When we ask people to break out and engage, and right now this feels very one-dimensional. This is the plenary. There are a lot of us, and I'm doing most of the talking, and all of you are, I really appreciate this listening. But when we break out into smaller groups and we have discussion and we feed back and we switch our cameras on, I believe we really do build the powerful network that helps culture, that builds the glue to culture. It's not ideal, of course it's not. And at some point, yeah.
So I think the challenge is hard. Like if you say you're a data capturer who works for Checkers and you're a data capturer for Woolworths, what's going to stop you? Just how do you create loyalty within your staff so that they don't go work for Woolworths? So that's going to be the challenges that we're going to have to deal with moving forward. I think at that level, you're doing the same job, but you don't have the picnic, the company picnics, you don't have the water cooler chat, you don't have the company cohesion. And I think that's going to be the challenges moving forward.
I think you're right. So hopefully we can find clever ways to build
I think,
that
Grant,
cohesion.
yeah, also it's, I mean, if for existing employees to be communicating and working together on Zoom, it's one thing, but both for new employees who coming into a team, as well as like in a work situation like Bev's, where you perhaps needing to meet with new clients or customers, and it's very hard to build those relationships from scratch over a screen as opposed to in person.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. So here's to some face-to-face, right? Here's to finding ways to do face-to-face. I don't know, go for a walk, go outside, etc. I mean, I've heard of, employers, doing recruitment sessions, in a walk outdoors. So I think, and you're so right, Bev. I mean, there's the grandfather of organization culture, Edgar Schein. He says, the problem with culture is that most of it is, he uses the iceberg analogy, most of culture is invisible. Only a bit of culture is visible. That's what we reduce to paper, artifacts. But most of culture is the underlying assumptions and the values and attitudes. And we only get that when we start to get some connection going. I do see some interesting comments from Liat. Liat, you're saying, what's beautiful about the future is people's fresh enthusiasm for their jobs and employers, an opportunity to work and be with people face to face. Absolutely, Liat. I mean, how exciting it's going to be when one day we can actually get face to face, right? Such a good point. Anything else in your mind? Anyone who'd like to ask a question? Elaine, I see you've put your camera on. Thank you for doing that. And I'm wondering if there's something that you're thinking about that might be interesting and beneficial for the rest of us.
So Grant, a quick question, if you've got time for this, is, if you're an entrepreneur running your own business and you're the only person in that business, so you're actually doing everything, as I discussed with you earlier today in our communication, what is, and you've given some incredible insights. I love that triangle with facing reality, improvise, anchor meaning and all that. But how does the entrepreneur decide which framework to work with? Because when you go through your book, yes, it's a working document, and it's you touch on lots and lots of frameworks for strategy, and they all have different purposes. But if you were to just guide entrepreneurs who, as I say, are running micro businesses, and there's literally one person in the business and that person's really doing everything, then what would be the most effective way to tackle strategy if you don't have a team to do it with?
Yeah, good question. So, the thing is, Lisa, my book, only covers a minute fraction of the frameworks and tools available. And there are a whole lot of useful frameworks and tools, that help us filter. Well, that's what a strategy tool does. A model or tool helps us look at a complex, messy situation and filter it to try and get an answer. And in my book, I have as I said, I'm a pracademic rather than an academic, so I'm very interested in simplifying which is why, I say, multiple perspectives, top down, bottom up, outside in, inside out. Why I say engage in a strategic conversation today, future, options, actions, because I'm trying to simplify. And within each of those questions, those simple questions an entrepreneur may ask herself, are some models or tools that you can apply to try and get clarity, to prioritize. Strategy is ultimately about choosing. There's some things you've got to stop doing in order to have time to do other things, right? That you should start doing. It's about making a choice and heading in a direction that feels aligned with your values and your passion and your objectives in order to, what's strategy about? It's about achieving our purpose, about winning what it is that we hope for. So my advice would be curious, try different things to discover what tools, what frameworks, what models are going to help you best, and discard the ones that don't work. Don't sweat the small stuff. Really, you don't need much. In my book, wow, there might be 30 or 40 models that work for me, that help me have a very practical conversation. They may work for you, which is a plug for the book, by the way. But you don't need my book. You can go online and Google. You can go to 12manage.com or mindtools.com. You can get a whole lot of strategy tools for free. No problem with that. So I think that my advice is, if you're feeling frustrated, where do I start? You've got to start with curiosity. We used to say in the old days, curiosity killed the cat. But that's fake news. Curiosity skilled the cat. Just put the S in front of killed. Curiosity skilled the cat. Get curious, guys. And of course, when we do a search, when we look on Google for some practical tools to get us going, likelihood is we find something that's useful. So that would be my advice. Don't, think about, as you said, Lisa Diane Kutu's model, face reality, improvise, and anchor in meaning. So face your reality as an entrepreneur if you're a one-person show, and improvise. And improvising doesn't mean you've got to be an expert if you don't know, but you've got lots of tools in your tool, a lot of ways of engaging by being curious. Go into Google, pose a question, see what comes up. Buy my book.
Grant, thank you.
Second plug. I didn't make so many plugs for the book, right?
No, we've got to make plugs for the book. So just on behalf of everyone here this evening, thank you so much. What a great conversation, so engaging. You really gave us ways to understand it from an entrepreneurial perspective, or people who are running community organizations. And I do encourage everyone to go out and buy the book. Where can we get it from again? I know you said Take a Lot and pretty much any bookshop.
Yeah, you can order the book. It's published by Van Skyke Publishers, so all good bookshops will be able to get it for you. You can buy it online at takealot.com. There's an ebook, by the way. So what I'll do, Lisa, I'll give you the ebook details if you prefer to read that way. And if you can't get it on Take a Lot because the book has sold out very quickly, it's on a second reprint already, I do have some copies at my office in Bredar Street in Cape Town, which is just down the road from Astra. So maybe, Lisa, I can just give you my contact details if people would like to get a copy of the book.
Perfect. I'll share that with them tomorrow with the recording. But yeah, thank you everyone for joining us tonight, and hope you gained great perspective on strategy. And Grant, once again, thanks for your time and your support. And keep safe, everybody, and we'll look forward to seeing you all at the next one.
Thank you so much, everyone, for staying online. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Grant.
Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Amal. Cool.